Merry Christmas Eve Eve. And Shalom, my dear friends. It is Friday morning and it is 2 days before Christmas. Can you believe it? Grab yourself a cup of coffee or your favorite beverage, something warm to cozy up with, and your Bible, and come join me. We're going to do something just a little different. I told you in last week's video that I was going to go back to the Christmas story. We have been moving forward in the Gospels for 14 months, over 14 months, and moving slowly through it. And I did the Christmas story, the second video in the series. So it was about October of 2021. And I will go ahead and link that up here. And then I will also put that down in the description so that you can find that video, because I'm going to do something a little different today. I didn't want to repeat what I did before I read through it, and we went through it verse by verse and looked at all the characters and the places and the faces and all of that. And today I really wanted, actually all week long, I have wanted to see what the story before the story looked like. So grab your hot drink, your beverage of choice, and grab your Bible. I will be going through these verses quite quickly. I'm going to try to go through this as quick as possible. So grab yourself a tablet and a pen so you can just write them down and maybe look them up later as well. So I'll be right back. Okay, so we are looking at the story before the Christmas story. Did you know that there's a story before that? Well, the entire Old Testament is actually just leading up to Christ's birth. The entire Old Testament is filled with prophecies and storylines that will show you why we need a Savior. It is this battle between good and evil, this battle between the flesh and the spirit, battle between God and evil, and our fall and his redemption, our fall again, man's fall again, and his grace and his mercy. His anger, yes, is in there, but that is because after many years, he says, okay, we got to punish some things. We got to get things straight. Let's try this again. And so that's what you're going to see played out in the Old Testament. And I'm going to try to give us an overview as quickly as I can. There are a lot of stories, and they are true stories. They are proven with archaeological evidence, many of them. The places and the faces, you can actually prove archaeologically, and so it's really exciting to discover and read through the Old Testament. But I know in our study we are studying the New Testament. But if you get a chance, when we are done here, we'll go to the Old Testament and start to learn why the New Testament is so important. It puts light on the New Testament. You can't have the New Testament without the Old Testament. It's the story before the story. So let me give you a quick overview. And what I did this week is I was like, I want to know what all the prophecies are for Jesus, and where they were fulfilled and all of that kind of stuff from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And so I Googled that, and I found some really neat articles about the prophecies and how they were foretold in the New Testament. So I ended up on this one site. I think that was my favorite. And I, once again, I'm going to put that. It's just an article. I ended up printing it out. And I'm going to put that down in the description. It's called 351 Old Testament Prophecies Fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And on this paper, I do not have the website, but I will have the link down there. I want to give them credit for doing all of the work. There's 20 pages I printed out and 351 prophecies that were told in the Old Testament, and then the scripture of when it was fulfilled in the New Testament. So how you'll see on that article is I have writing all over it too, but on the column here is the prophecy, and that is where you're going to find the prophecy in the Old Testament, and it goes in chronological order, so you can just kind of go through. And then in the middle is the description of what the prophecy is. It'll give you kind of a little summary. And then the fulfillment, where you're going to find verses about the fulfillment that Jesus fulfilled those requirements. Anyways, it was really, really interesting. And there are so many prophecies, and this is Christmas. So I started just looking for the prophecies that had to do with his birth and why Jesus is considered to be the Messiah of the Old Testament. And so I thought I'd just do this overview, and I'm going to see how quick I could do this. Is if you know some of these stories, but you probably don't know all of the stories, but I'm going to probably do the more popular ones and the ones, there's a lot in between. So it starts at the very beginning of the book in Genesis 1:1, the very first, pretty much the first page or second page. It depends on what you've got in the front of your Bible, but when it first starts, Genesis 1:1 is in the beginning, God created. And you can read about his creation and how he created the world, and he created light. And then he created man and woman, and he created them so that he would be able to have a relationship with them. And he would walk in the garden with them. And then I'm giving the quick overview, but then they fell and they sinned, and he had to kick them out of the garden. See, in order to be in God's presence, we need to follow his rules. In order to be in his kingdom, he wants his kingdom, and he wants the things that surround him to be good. He wants his kingdom to be filled with love and respect and honor and mercy and grace. And when we don't follow the rules and we hurt others, and we hurt him as well. And so he had to kick him out of the garden. That's the short story of the long story. And then the rest of the book begins the battle or the tug, shall we say, of God trying to pull his people back to him. And then them falling and him picking them back up, him forgiving them, him having mercy, him having grace. But there's certain characters that go through, and they all become the line of Christ that will eventually be Jesus being born. And so it starts with Adam and Eve and that fall. It kind of, then the world gets worse, and then Noah, and Noah's Ark. God says it's so bad that there's only one man in his family I want to save, and I'm going to wipe out the rest of the world. And then he starts over, and he has Noah. And then shortly after that, sin comes right back into it, and they're not following the rules again, and it gets worse again. And it's just one thing after another, where they're trying to be their own God. They're trying to have things their own way. And God has given us a free will, but if we follow the rules or his laws, they are for the good of people. Then there won't be so much hurt and hate and murder and adultery, and he doesn't want to live around all of that. And so then once again, we've got a bad world, and he sees one man again who is standing out and is faithful to him and who believes in him and loves him. And his name is Abram at the time. And he pulls him aside and says, I want to make a great nation out of you. I want to make an example to the other nations so that I can bless other people. They'll look at you and say, why is he so blessed? I want to follow his God. And so he says, I want you to move, and I'm going to give you this other land. I'm going to give your descendants. I'm going to make you, your descendants as numerous as the stars or the sand in the sea. And that's where we have at the kind of beginning of Genesis. I think that gets into the teens, like Genesis 12 and stuff like that. We're looking at Abram. And God actually, when he chooses him, turns his name to Abraham. You probably have heard of Abraham. And then there's the story of him constantly giving him the promise. And then he gives it to his son, Isaac. And there's a test in there to see if he loves Isaac more than he loves God. And Abraham passes the test, and God stops him from sacrificing his son and says, again, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless your nation. A nation will come out of you, and a nation will come out of your son, Isaac. And I am telling these stories quickly. You've got to go back and read them. They are so good. And then Isaac, he grows up, and then he gets married. And then he has Jacob and Esau. You probably have heard of the Jacob and Esau story. And all along there, by the way, I'm going to give you really quickly right here some of the promises. Let me go back to the fall of man. In Genesis 3:15, you're going to see that that a promise is made that the seed of a woman, in other words, one of her descendants, will come back and basically conquer the snake, evil, sin, and that seed is going to be Jesus. And you can look up Galatians 4:4-5, and you'll actually see some of that. You can also look at Matthew 1:18, which is Jesus's birth, and do that. It also in Genesis 3:15 talks about how this seed of this woman will bruise Satan's head. The snake and the woman will become kind of like enemies, and that eventually that the seed of this woman, which will be Jesus, will bruise Satan's head. In other words, he's going to do something big to conquer this sin from way at the beginning. And you'll find some great verses that in the New Testament, Hebrews 2:14 and John 3:7-8. Those are really good to look up. You can also grab this whole print off if you go to their website. For the Abraham, Genesis 12:3 is the seed of Abraham will bless all nations. It's the promise that his seed, we've got this running theme of the seed, which is basically his descendants. You can see that in Galatians 3:8 and also Acts 3:25-26. Sorry, that's my trash man going by for the 8th time. He must have missed some trash cans. Oh, and then with Isaac, Genesis 22:18. It's again God promising that Isaac's seed will bless the nations. So we're just passing this along, this promise that's kind of going to be this thread that goes all the way through the Old Testament into Jesus. And you can also look up Galatians 3:16, and that has something that correlates with that. Now we are to Jacob and Esau, and you guys know the story of Jacob and Esau, how Jacob stole Esau's birthright, and a birthright is basically his inheritance and his blessing from his father. And then he's on the run, and he is running for his life, and kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and he's so upset that he lays his head down from exhaustion, and God gives him a dream. And it's a dream of, a lot of people call it the Stairway to Heaven. Probably a little bit where that song came from, I don't know. But God gives him this dream of the angels of God going up and down on this stairway from heaven to earth. And then he appears, the Lord appears and says, Jacob, you're now the one I'm going to bless, and your seed will then, the Messiah will come from, basically. And you can find that in Genesis 28:12. And you can also correlate that with John 1:51. And that is when Jesus' word says, you will see angels ascending and descending. And so Jesus actually talks about this stairway to heaven as well. Then you can also look up Genesis 28:14, which is right in that same passage that you were in. And it tells about the seed of Jacob, that it's the Lord promising Jacob that he will bless him and his seed. It's that seed again. Okay, and then let's see, Genesis 49:10 actually talks about that the Messiah will come from Judah, and it's the seed of Judah. And you can look up Luke 3:33 to cover that. And Judah is actually one of Jacob's sons. He has 12 sons, and there's a whole story in there as well. And they become the tribes of Israel. And once again, God is promising that through their line, that God would give Israel, which is all 12 tribes, he would bless them and he would save them. And so you can look up that, like I said, Genesis 49:10. And also, if you look up Luke 3:33 is Jesus's genealogy, and you will see that Jesus comes from the line of Judah, from the son. You will see it goes from Jacob to Judah, and then it goes to all of Judah's descendants, and it gets right to Jesus. And then there's this whole thing about one of the sons is Joseph. You probably have heard of him. Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Not really, but it is Joseph with the coat of many colors. And his brothers are jealous. That's one of Jacob's 12 sons. The brothers are jealous, and they kind of throw him into a pit, and then they sell him to Egypt as a slave. He ends up there, and that is the story of how all the Israelites end up in Egypt as slaves, because there's a famine in the land, and Joseph kind of through the years worked himself from being a slave to being the head of a house, to being in prison, to then being a ruler. And that's a really interesting story. You will find that in Exodus. Actually, end of Genesis, I'm sorry. Well, and going into Exodus. So end of Genesis, you're going to find this story. Actually, you might even find that right in Exodus, but I'm not sure where it splits. But go ahead and read through that exciting story. And then there's a famine in the land. The brothers have to go find food. Then they end up back in Egypt. And guess who is the ruler giving them their food but their brother that they sold into slavery? And the plot thickens. But anyways, there's a whole thing there. Finally, Joseph gets to see his dad and his brothers, and he says, you know what, there's a famine. Come live here and I'll give you all that you need. So the entire family, the 12 sons and Jacob, move to Egypt. They live happily ever after. Kind of, not really. Because now Joseph dies, all of these brothers die, but their descendants are there. and the new Pharaoh doesn't really know who Joseph is and doesn't treat them favorably, and turns them into slaves. Another long story, but they cry out to God for 400 years. 400 years they're in Egypt as slaves, crying out to God, wondering why God isn't answering, saying, God, why have you left us here? And God answers in the form of Moses. And you probably know that. He was an Israelite. I don't want to get into all the stories. I'll be here all day, but basically the story of Moses, you can watch the movie. He is going to be killed by the Pharaoh, because Pharaoh has decreed all the newborn or the baby boys be killed. And he's saved miraculously by putting him in a little boat on the river. His sister watches him, and he ends up in the hands of the king's or the Pharaoh's daughter. She adopts him. He grows up in the palace as royalty until he's an adult. He realizes that he is actually a Hebrew. He's upset with them hurting the Hebrews, the slave owners or the slave masters, and he kills one of them in anger or frustration because he was beating the Hebrew. Runs for his life. He's out in the desert, I think 40 years. And then God comes to him in a burning bush. You know the story. Once again, God is going to now reach out and try to bring his people close to him. He's let them, there's been so much sin and so much things happen that sometimes God just kind of stands back and lets us put ourselves into misery. And he doesn't answer that cry for help for a little bit, because he wants us to feel the pain so that when he comes back and says, okay, are you ready now? Are you ready for me to set you free? Then we'll be ready and excited to have him back. Other than that, we try to go our own way. It's that battle between flesh and spirit. It's that battle between evil and good. It's that reaching out of God to his people. And now he's reaching out and saying, I'm going to go ahead and save them. He speaks to Moses in a burning bush and says, okay, I need you to go and rescue my people. And Moses doesn't think that they're going to believe him. So he says, who do I say that I am? And if you go to Exodus 3:13 through 15, you're going to actually see, and I do want to go there. I'm trying not to read too much today. I'm giving you these so that you can look them up in the sake of time. But I do want to read this one because this compares to Jesus. This is God speaking to Moses in the burning bush. And Moses said to them, suppose I go to the Israelites. I am in Exodus 3:13. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. That is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me. Now they all know in their history that their forefathers are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so he's basically saying, I am the God that your ancestors trusted, the ones that gave that promise that you guys were going to be numerous, that I would give you a land and take care of you. They've probably been for 400 years kind of thinking maybe, their ancestors were wrong. But here he's telling them, oh, we're going to start this promise again. I'm going to come and save you. But why this relates to the Christmas story is because Jesus claimed to be the great I am. I'm going to tell you these really quick so that for the sake of time, but I'll put them up here. In John 4:26, Jesus meets the woman at the well, and he tells her that it is I am him. I am him. When she asks about someday there'll be a Messiah, and that Messiah will tell us what we need to know. And he says, hey woman, I am. I am he. So he has an I am statement. And then in John 8:58, he actually states that he is eternal. I actually want to turn there for sake of time. Okay, so he's talking to the crowds, to the religious leaders, to everybody. And he says in 8:58, very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. He's basically saying that he was here before Abraham and that he is. There's a whole thing, if you look at Genesis 1:1 and John 1:1, where John shows that Jesus was there at the beginning of creation. There's a whole thing there. I'd love to discuss that with you if you want to in the comments where we have a little bit more time. Ask me about that. But look up Genesis 1:1 and also look up John 1:1. And then also look up Genesis 1:26, where God says, let us, underline us, make man in our, plural, image, in our likeness. And then so God created man in his image. Jesus was there at creation. Jesus shows up through the entire Old Testament, and you can find him there. Often he's called the angel of God, or the Lord. Sometimes he's called the Lord, all caps, Lord. So we have Jesus saying that he is the I am. I'm trying to stick with just the prophecies of his birth. There's a lot of prophecies here and a lot of his life and his death that were fulfilled in Jesus. But I want to tell you about the 7 I am statements that Jesus made in John, in the book of John. You will find in John 6:35 that he says, I am the bread of life. That's the number 1 I am statement. Number 2 I am statement is that he is the light of the world. He says, I am the light of the world. That's in John 8:12. Number 3, he says, I am the gate for the sheep, or some translations say I'm the door. You'll find that in John 10:7. That's his 3rd I am statement. His 4th I am statement is in John 10:14, where he says, I am the good shepherd. His 5th I am statement is in John 11:5. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. The 6th, he says in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And the number 7 in John 15:1, he says, I am the true vine. If you stay connected to me, it has that whole chapter 15 is all about staying connected in the true vine. I wanted to venture off into that, even though it has nothing to do with his birth. It has to do with his life. He's stating that he is God right there. So we have 400 years. Now Moses is on the scene, and we all know that story. Let my people go. He is the first of the official messiahs. I don't know if you would consider Noah kind of a messiah, just for his family though. This is the first messiah that actually comes to free the Israelites. And he's a kind of Christ. Christ will be the greater of the messiahs. And so some of these things that Messiah leads them through, like you will see in Exodus. Read through Exodus, and you're going to see little pictures of Christ throughout it. When they're doing all the plagues, the last plague is the Passover. It's where the death angel passes over, and they have to do a ceremony where they have to kill a lamb, and then they have that lamb for dinner, and they take its blood and they put it over the doorway, and that is the blood of Jesus. It's a representation that the death angel will pass over a family that has or a person that has the blood over the door, meaning the door over your heart or the door over you personally. There's a lot of symbolism in the Old Testament which will then be fulfilled in the New Testament. But that's about Easter. We're talking Christmas. So also when Moses leads them through the wilderness, he gives them, well, God through Moses gives them manna, which is bread. And Jesus says, I am the bread. He gives them water, and Jesus says to the woman at the well, I am the living water. So you've got that whole thing. So you had, now we've got the Israelites, they're free, they're in the wilderness. He brings them to the promised land, and he then gives them the 10 commandments. Like we said, in the desert, in the desert, in the garden, he wanted them to follow certain rules, and they only had one rule. It was, don't eat of this tree. And now here they are this many years later, and now God's given them a series of rules, and it's the 10 commandments. And it's basically, if you live like this, you're going to find peace. If you live like this, you can be in my presence. But right away, they kind of fall, and we're right back to just like the garden. We're right back to the fall of man, and they keep falling. And this is a constant story of him pursuing them, saving them, giving them some guidelines, telling them to remember, telling them he only wants them to have one God. And we go through this. Then we get to David, and a lot of the prophecies actually are in the Psalms. There were a ton of prophecies in the Psalms from David. So this is many, many years later. Israel is now a nation and all of that kind of stuff. And now we have David, and there's the story of David and his son Solomon. And David and Solomon are kings, and they're kind of a representation a little bit of Christ, but they are human. Just like Moses, he was human. He represented God's love and God's leading and God's setting them free. Same with David, kind of represents how God wants to govern us and love us. But of course, David was a human and had a lot of failures. And then Solomon, he was a good and wise king, but then he had a lot of wives and he fell. And it's that story again. And then we go through kings where they fall. We have a good king and a bad king and a bad king and a good king and a bad king. And it's this love story of this, we're following God. No, we're not following God. Now we're worshiping other idols. We are, and there goes the trash truck again. He must be just going to hang out in our neighborhood. Anyway, but it's just a constant. So you go all through Kings, or Samuel, and then you go through the Kings, and it's just this constant battle. And I even forgot about Judges, which is a whole sin mess. But it's just this up and down and up and down. And that's why the story is so important, because now all of the prophets keep saying there's going to be a Messiah. There's going to be a Messiah. You screwed up again. And in fact, you screwed up so bad that God's going to almost wipe you guys out. He's going to have enemies come and destroy your city. And they're going to take you into exile. But then I'm going to, once again, you'll be slaves again. But then I'm going to reach down and say, you know what, let's try this again. It's like it's like a bad child. You have to keep punishing them, and then you make up with them and everything's good, and then they do it again, and you go, in order for you guys to be responsible adults, I have to keep punishing you, so that you, lovingly punishing you, so that when you grow up, you're going to be a responsible adult. Well, the same thing is that pattern with the Old Testament and the Israelites. So now we come to the end of, there are just so many here. So many. Oh, I want to do Isaiah. So Isaiah is one of the prophets in the middle of this back and forth mess. And his whole book has prophecies about Jesus. And there's a lot of them about his death and about how he's going to save Israel. But if you go to Isaiah chapter 9, there is a ton in there, but I'm going to just read verse 6, and it might go into 7. So this is the one you all know. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, and that's all caps. Once again, it's going to show that we're going to give you a son. He's going to be flesh, but he's also going to be God. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, which is God's name, Prince of Peace. God is the Prince of Peace. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. In other words, it's eternal. When he becomes king, see, we had David and we had Solomon, his son, and they were kings, but they kept messing up, and their kingdom was on earth. But God kept promising. You'll look in the story of David over and over again. He tells David that I'm going to make your generation, or your legacy, your seed, just like your seed, have a kingdom. Basically your great grandson is going to have a kingdom that will last eternally, forever. Well, how can you on earth have one that lasts eternally? And that is Jesus. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, because he is in the line of David. And you will actually see that in the beginning of Luke and the beginning of Matthew, where they actually have the genealogy. And so you can actually see the line go from all the way from Abraham to Jesus. And David is in the middle of that. Solomon's in the middle of that. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You'll see the whole line goes all the way to Jesus. So those are some of the prophecies about him. But there's page after page after page after page. And it's just that back and forth. So many prophecies in the Old Testament about our Jesus. So now we're at the end of the Old Testament, and we're in Micah. And what happens after all of the prophets, and they keep testifying that there's going to be this Messiah, and Israel is just looking for their Messiah. Who's going to come save us? Have you felt like that? I think as a little kid, I always wanted to have an older brother. I'm an oldest daughter, and I have 3 siblings below me. And so I was the one kind of in charge of taking care of them all. When we went to babysitters and somebody was picking on them, I was kind of the one taking care of everybody. But I had this want, or this desire, my whole life. I always asked my mom, I want an older brother. Not that she could have ever given me an older brother. It was too late unless we adopted. But I just always had this desire for an older brother. And I think it's because I had this desire to have somebody protect me, somebody to save me, And that's what this nation is going through. They have had so many years of turmoil and heartache, and we can kind of relate that to that here in the United States right now. Things have gotten bad, and sometimes it feels a little scary. Inflation is high, and we're not sure about our government and what's our future. Well, that's kind of where they are, but worse, because people could come in, another culture or another tribe could come in and kill you and your whole family, and there was no peace. And they just desired for somebody to come in and save them. And then what happens at the end? There's 400 years where God is silent. Another 400 years where we don't have anything written from God. He might have been speaking to individuals here and there, but we have no record from any prophets from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning, the Christmas story. And so for 400 years, they are just begging God to come save them. They're desolate. They're just needing help. In this time period, Jerusalem is destroyed again, and it's burned to the ground, and the Israelites are scattered everywhere. And then they come back again. It's a whole thing. So there's some history books that still state, we know kind of what happens in those 400 years, but we don't have any record of God speaking. And so I have gone just months without God speaking to me, and I feel alone and like, where are you? And did I do something wrong? I can't even imagine 400 years. Number one, I wouldn't live 400 years, but generation after generation after generation. And then all of a sudden, there's a break in the silence. And that is the story before the Christmas story. And now we are on to the Christmas story. But I'm not going to read that here for sake of time. You can read that yourself. You're going to find that in Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2. I would do it in this order. Let me give you that really quick. Luke 1, 5 through 25, you are going to read about Zechariah and Elizabeth, this priest that for 400 years, God has not spoken. And the first time it's recorded that God speaks is to Zechariah. He's a man that has been going through the motions, even though they haven't heard from God, even though things have been really, really bad. He keeps being faithful. He keeps showing up, doing his duties as a priest. He keeps worshiping his God. And he shows up, and an angel shows up and tells him he is going to have a son. And he is old, and his wife is old, and they have not been able to have children. Their lives have been hard. And he doesn't believe him, and he strikes him mute. It's a great story. You're going to find that in Luke 1, 5 through 25. And he will be the father of John the Baptist, who is also prophesied in the Old Testament that one like Elijah was a prophet in the Old Testament, will come to announce the coming of my Messiah. And John the Baptist will be that Elijah that announces and kind of paves the way for Jesus. And so that story is in Luke 1, 5 through 25. And then you will go to Luke 1, 26 through 38, where you see that God speaks again through an angel to Mary that she is going to have a baby, even though she has not been with a man. She is engaged, but not officially married in the sense of married. But now that she's going to have this baby and she's pregnant out of wedlock, her husband or her fiance, it was a kind of a different system back then, even though they were engaged, in order to break up, he'd have to divorce her, and he's going to divorce her quietly because he feels like she had an affair. So she runs off to see her cousin Elizabeth, and that's in Luke 1:39-56. And the baby within Elizabeth leaps, which is John the Baptist, who's going to announce the way, be the Elijah for Jesus, because he senses that Jesus is in Mary's womb. And so she has a wonderful little song there of praise. And she comes to acceptance that, God knows what he's doing. And even if I lose my marriage, it's going to be okay. And then Joseph, go to Matthew 1:18-25, and you're going to see Joseph's point of view and how he is going to quietly dismiss her and divorce her. But an angel comes to him. We've got God hasn't spoke for 400 years, and now he's speaking to everybody. He's on his third one. Then you're going to go back to Luke 2:1-40. You're going to see a beautiful, the one the birth of Jesus. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued. You know how it all goes. And then, let's see. Then you'll go to Jesus, right after that, there's the shepherds and all of that kind of stuff. And then Jesus presented at the temple. And that is a ceremony that 8 days after the birth of a child, the parents bring their boy child, to be circumcised and to be blessed and to get his name. And then they're going to run into two prophets who are old, who have been waiting their entire lives to see the fulfillment of the Messiah, and the two of them get to see it in person. One is Anna, and I'm trying to remember the name of Simon, I think. Yes. Anyways, there's the male prophet who gets really, really excited and holds him in his arms and is so excited. And then there's Anna, who is an older lady, a prophetess, that actually gets excited. Then you go back to Matthew chapter 2 to see the Magi, the wise men, and they visit the Messiah, Jesus. And that's a couple years into Jesus's life. And then because of their visit, Herod is actually now looking to kill the children, because he doesn't want anybody else being king. So they escape to Egypt, and you're going to go through that on Matthew 2. And then they return to Nazareth. And there is prophecy in the Old Testament that says that he would come out of Egypt. There's also prophecy that says he'll be from Nazareth. There's prophecy that talks about him being in Galilee, ministering in Galilee, and he actually starts his ministry in Galilee. Jesus, from start to finish in his life, fulfills all of these Old Testament prophecies, one after another, all the way to his death and his resurrection. The story of Christmas, the story of Jesus, began in Genesis 1:1. So I hope you enjoyed hearing my not so quick rendition. I tried to go fast. I mean, it's the whole Old Testament in under an hour. But to hear the Christmas story in a beautiful voice, I'll link it right here, and I'll also put it down in the description, from another YouTube channel. He does a wonderful reading where he goes back and forth and reads you the story, including Isaiah 9:6, where he is prophesied. And I just hope that you can look at Christmas and the Christmas story in a completely new light. I hope that this just opens your eyes and your vision and your awe, that this Jesus, this story that we've become so accustomed to, is so much bigger than we ever imagined. The story began in Genesis 1:1, and this story is the completion of a love story of God and his people, and the fight between evil and good. So listen to the Christmas story. Read the Christmas story with your family. My parents, growing up, my dad always read us the Christmas story out of our big Bible every Christmas Eve, and we would take all of the characters from the Nativity and we'd move them all into their proper spots as the story was being read. And so for my whole life, I remember this story over and over again. And familiarity can actually make us feel like it's not special. But if you really get to know it and learn how huge this was, that these people had waited their entire lives, thousands of years, everybody looked for the Messiah, and here he was showing up on the scene in page 1 of our New Testament. So anyways, Merry Christmas, everyone. I hope you have the most wonderful, wonderful Christmas. I hope you spend a lot of time with your family, but I hope you stop and read the Christmas story with new eyes and new light. And that this Prince of Peace will bring peace into your life, and you can see why he's the Prince of Peace. Love you all. Have a wonderful Christmas, and I will see you in the next video, probably right before the new year, as we jump into this brand new year. I hope that you bring the Prince of Peace with you in a whole new light. Shalom, dear friends. Have a wonderful Christmas. Bye.